Section 3. Testing your application. In this section, we're going to look at the types of testing that are available. We're going to create and run unit tests. We're going to run functional manual tests, automated UI testing, and then finally, we'll have a look at performance testing and how that works within the Visual Studio and Team Foundation landscape. So back to when we started talking about testing. At the start, there's a number of different testing types. You can talk about integration testing, otherwise known as unit tests. There's also cloud testing, so testing UI and also performance, so that's functional and non-functional testing. And we're going to move on to monitoring in the next section. Testing your application, the different types of testing. In this video, we're going to show you how to build and deploy testing. We're going to go very high level, and we're going to be covering some of the technologies and frameworks that you can use, and how to achieve continuous testing. When we talk about continuous testing in Visual Studio and Team Foundation Server, what we're talking about is the ability to release quickly into production. So this requires extensive testing to be done, and part of it is understanding the comprehensive amount of testing that you need to run to give you the amount of quality that gives you the level of assurance required to release your code into production. So continuous testing is a prerequisite for continuous delivery. I've talked about continuous testing and I've explained how complex it is because the landscape is hugely vast and has upstream and downstream systems, or a number of ecosystems that you must test to ensure that everything is going to work correctly. So this could be talking about stubbing and shipping out systems, which we're going to cover in unit testing, to how we test with automation continuously and provide the level of metrics that to give us assurance around whether or not we should release or not release. So what's the journey towards continuous testing? Traditionally, organizations look at bringing in some kind of level of UI testing, which we're going to cover later on. But really, to achieve continuous testing, we need to think about more complex components, such as how to model tests, and also API testing of things like services for those upstream and downstream systems. So depending on your maturity of your organization, will depend on how many of these that you are currently doing or have or looking to target. As I mentioned, this is highly complex ecosystem, and just setting up some of the end-to-end scenarios and also providing the level of information is vast when it comes to the Visual Studio Team Services and Team Foundation Server. I'm using this screen as an example, and I will cover through many of these components through the next coming videos. The value, what they bring to the end-to-end testing of your application. But let me just start off, again, a very high-level look at the target architecture for configuring Visual Studio Team Services. As you can see, depending on how you set this up within your environment, you may have to configure a whole stack of ports and also deploy a number of different types of agents. This has been simplified when using Azure, but when on-prem, you need to be thinking about how you can set up this kind of configuration ahead of execution, because things like PowerShell and desired configuration state require you to have the necessary rights on those VMs or in those virtual networks or your own DMZ to actually be able to test the various different components and deploy the software that you need as part of some of the vNext and build which we've covered in previous videos. But as I mentioned, we need to think about this end-to-end ecosystem from code all the way to production, but also beyond. So part of design ops extends and shifts it left further than just DevOps and looks at requirements engineering. It looks at the understanding of visualizing those requirements. So that could be something like using business process modeling notation, or it could be using executable specifications such as BDD, ATDD, and TDD, which are the behavior-driven development, test-driven development, and acceptance test-driven development. So things like spec flow within a Visual Studio environment is very common. But once you've modeled those scenarios or those tests, and you've coded them, we're going to cover today some of those functional and non-functional components and how important they are to be able to achieve continuous testing to allow us to get to continuous deployment and delivery. And then finally, in the next chapter, we're going to cover the measure and monitor component, which is learning from what's actually been deployed.